Hi everyone, my name's Anthony and I'm a scientist here at the Australian Wine Research Institute. And I'd just like to spend a little bit of time telling you about an exciting new citizen science project that we have called Yeast Catchers, fantastic yeasts and how to catch them. Hopefully by the end of my presentation, you'll be as excited about yeast as I am and want to be a part of our really interesting project. So, biodiversity. We can all look out the window and see our local biodiversity. Birds, plants, lizards, insects. Really obvious things that are out there that we can see. But what about the hidden biodiversity? What about all the things in our environment that we can't see? This is the world of the microbes. So things that are too small to be seen with the naked eye. Microbes, as the name suggests, you can only see them under the microscope. Now these can be really tiny plants such as plankton or very small insects. Also all the bacteria that are around us. And accompanying the bacteria are yeasts. Now yeasts aren't bacteria, even though they're microbes and sometimes they're confused with bacteria. They're actually more like very small microscopic mushrooms. Now, when I say small, I mean really small. So if this, for example, is a human hair, 100 micrometers across, a micrometer being 1/1,000,000th of a meter, you can actually fit 20 yeast end to end across a human hair. They are really tiny. But nevertheless, even though they're so tiny, they live, they grow, they have babies, they eat, they do many of the same things that we do. So what do these microbes look like? So under the microscope, yeast can be a number of different shapes and sizes. Long, skinny balls, more like soccer balls, more like lemons, upside down palm trees. Their main characteristic is, for the most part, they are single cells, and they can divide by growing another yeast on the side and separating. And that's what we're seeing here, for example. So this is a yeast growing a new yeast on the side, a process called budding. Now all these different yeasts that I've got pictured here are different species, just like a dog is a different species to a cat, different species to a cow. These are all many different species, and there are thousands of different species of yeast. And some can be as distantly related as, for example, a cow and a fish, even though they may look fairly similar. They are separated by millions of years of evolution. Now these pictures are under a light microscope, and many of you may have used a light microscope, but there are also machines called electron microscopes, and they can blow up a yeast thousands and thousands of times, really zoom in, and that's what we're looking at here. So this is a yeast cell under an electron microscope. You can see the mother cell with the daughter cell coming off. So this daughter cell will progressively get bigger and bigger until it's almost the size of a mother cell, and then it will break away, and so one yeast will become two. And this can be a very rapid process. So some yeast cells can divide within an hour. And so over the course of a day, a single yeast cell can have millions of offspring. So they can divide very rapidly. Now these sort of funny shapes on the surface of our mother cell that we've got labelled here as bud scars, when our daughter cell pops off, this is what's left behind. So you can actually count up these bud scars and work out how many babies each mother cell actually has or has had. So where do yeast live? So as I mentioned, it's part of the hidden biodiversity. They're all around us. But primarily, if you want to focus in on where the yeast live where the sugar is. So yeast love sugar. And so you can find them on flowers, on bark and on leaves, on fruit, especially rotting fruit. And not surprisingly, you can find them on insects and within insect guts. And that's because insects are often also eating the sugar from many of these environmental sources. Now, insects have wings and legs, they can get around. Yeast don't have legs, don't have wings. They're kind of stuck in one place, except for using insects, like little Ubers. So when the insects also feed off the flower, they can pick up yeast and take it to the next flower or take it to some fruit. We also find yeast associated in the soil. So as part of healthy soil, all the microbes in soils, there's also yeast in there. So what do they eat? As I mentioned, yeast's favourite food is sugar. Very unhealthy diet for us, but that is yeast's primary source of food. Now what we have pictured here, this particular yeast is baker's yeast. This is what's used for making bread. And the scientific name for this yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Saccharomyces actually means sugar fungus, which describes it perfectly. They love sugar. They love to eat sugar. And then like us, when you eat something, you make waste. Their waste is carbon dioxide gas and ethanol. And so this is the main process by which yeast get energy to grow. It's called fermentation, and humans have actually taken advantage of fermentation for thousands of years. So what can they do? Well, simple answer is most yeast, we will never, ever even worry about their existence. They're quite benign. The ones we see, the ones we notice, are the bad ones, and there are some bad yeast. They will make you sick. This is a poor person with a yeast infection on their tongue. But many, many more yeast are actually very useful. Now, humans and yeast have a long, long history of thousands of years associated together. And some people actually say that yeasts are the first domesticated animals. Domesticated in the sense that we were taking advantage of the way yeast eat sugar and make carbon dioxide gas to make bread, for example, taking the sugar in flour, making gas, CO2 to make the bread rise. You also see yeast in the production of other foods and beverages like kombucha or coffee, kefir. More recently, we've taken advantage of yeast's ability to make alcohol to make biofuels. So taking sugar, making bioethanol to put into petrol, for example, to help cut down how many fossil fuels we use. We've also taken advantage of yeast from a biotechnology standpoint, where we can use yeast to make very, very powerful pharmaceuticals like insulin that save thousands of lives every year. So how do you tell yeast apart? So I mentioned we can look at them under the microscope. Sometimes you can tell yeast apart. So for example, you can clearly see that this yeast looks different to this one, a little ball versus an upside down palm tree. What about the two yeast on either side? Both look like little balls that can bud. But in fact, if you actually look into the detail of yeast more closely, you may actually find that these two yeast, even though they look very similar, are separated by the same sort of level, same amount of evolution as a cow and a fish, for example. So millions and millions of years of evolution separate yeast that look very similar. So there are methods to sometimes look at the specific sugars that yeast can eat and help that to define or to tell them apart. But more and more nowadays, we actually turn to genome sequencing. So yeast, just like us, just like other animals, have DNA. They have chromosomes and genes, and these specify how the yeast will grow and what they can do. And so we take advantage of that, and we can actually take our yeast, isolate DNA from them, and use DNA sequencing, genome sequencing, to be able to get a genomic fingerprint of our yeast, and then use that genomic fingerprint to tell them apart. What species is this yeast? How far removed is it from this other species? Are they related? Are they closely related? Are they distantly related? What do we think this yeast can do? And so we're always on the hunt to find new yeast, because new yeast can have uses that we haven't defined before. So we can find a new yeast with new properties, and this may help make a new beverage or be very, very useful for biotechnology in making a new pharmaceutical or a new chemical. But we can't be everywhere. So we go out and we try and find yeast in the environment, but we can't go everywhere. We only have so much time. So we actually need help finding new yeast. And this is where our citizen science project comes in. So how can you help? So we're asking schools to get in on yeast hunting. So we're turning to you to provide samples from around your school and other interesting places. And so the samples can be anything, anywhere where we think yeast might grow. Remember, flowers, leaves, gum nuts, bark, soil. Yeast is all around us. So the samples are really only limited by your imagination and what you can obtain from the environment. So all you have to do is recognise a sample, pick out a sample, and we're going to send tubes out to your school. Now the tubes have a special growing solution in them, which has sugar for the yeast to grow, but also has other things in there to stop bacteria growing and other things like moulds. So it's a solution that yeast really love and most other microbes don't like. So you take your sample, pop it in the growing solution, put on the lid, and then you can let it sit in the classroom. Now, if there's yeast in your sample, a couple of things should happen. The solution should start to go cloudy. Now, it's going cloudy because that one yeast has turned into millions of yeast. It's been using the sugar to grow, one becoming millions. And then there's so many in that tube that it actually starts to turn it cloudy. So you can actually start to see all those yeasts working together to make the solution go cloudy. It should also go foamy because the yeast are taking the sugar, making that carbon dioxide, making those bubbles. So cloudy, foamy, there should be yeast in there. So you take those cloudy and foamy tubes and send them into us, and our scientists will go to work. They'll take pictures of the yeast under the microscopes so we can get a picture, see what they look like. But of course that only tells us part of the problem, part of what the yeast is, because they're very hard to tell apart. But we'll then do that next step as well. So we'll isolate DNA from those yeasts, do genome sequencing on them, and we'll see what kind of yeast they are. And you never know. We find new species of yeast quite regularly because that's a real area, because you can't see it so readily. It's a real area where you can still find new species. So from your samples, we may actually find new species of yeast, and down the track, we may actually find that they have really useful properties that we can take advantage of. But if nothing else, we can tell you what yeast you found. Of course, you know where they've come from. Hopefully you'll tell us, we know where they come from. We can tell you what's around your school. So you'll get an insight into that hidden biodiversity that's around you every day. So hopefully you think your class or your school has what it takes to be a yeast catcher. If you do, please get in touch. My email address is there. And yeah, hopefully we'll have everyone on board for yeast catchers going forward and find some really interesting yeast biodiversity around Australia.